Hi, I'm Gina-R-Farrar, reinvention coach, creator and host of Feminine Roadmap podcast, and leader of this amazing global community of women. If you are approaching midlife or are already in the thick of it, welcome home. Please grab a cup of something wonderful and join me for some real talk, practical strategies, and a big dose of sisterhood. I am so glad you're here. Hello, Feminine Roadmappers. Welcome back to Feminine Roadmap Podcast, the podcast that helps you navigate the challenges and changes of midlife and to live a more vibrant second half. Today, we're going to be talking about living a life of intention. And to have this conversation with me is Dr. Greg Hammer. He's a professor, a physician, the best-selling author of Gain Without Pain, The Happiness Handbook for Healthcare Professionals, and a mindfulness expert. Dr. Greg, thank you so much for being with me today.
My pleasure, Gina.
So I understand that you have this method called GAIN. How did you come to formulate the GAIN method?
That's an interesting question. I think several arrows just sort of pointed toward that direction. I've been a long time seeker of the truth, as most of us are. And I sort of had an epiphany about 10 years ago that, in fact, the truth is within us at all times, and there's really nothing for which to look. And in sitting with that understanding, the essentials of happiness, which is that which all 7 billion of us seek, include gratitude. I think we can all agree on that. You can be happy and poor. You can be physically disabled and happy, but you'll never see someone who's ungrateful and happy. So gratitude, of course, is central. It also occurred to me that life is full of joy, but also pain and suffering. And we can minimize that suffering by accepting that which is painful for us. And if we don't do that, if we resist it, in fact, the pain will be associated with a magnified degree of suffering. Intention. I'm a fan of Jon Kabat-Zinn, who I consider to be the grandfather of mindfulness. And he defined mindfulness as being aware of the present moment on purpose, non-judgmentally. So I think that's where the I and the N in GAIN come into play. That is, intention, as you identified as one of the purposes of our conversation, is to discuss that. And the other one is non-judgment. And it occurred to me that we're always comparing and judging things in our environment, and we point to ourselves with that judgment as well, perhaps most harshly. And so I wanted to get the message out. I'm part of an organization at Stanford called WellMD, which was formed to address the growing problem of burnout among physicians. And I was asked to give a talk about burnout and wellness and at a national meeting, and then that sort of took a life of its own on. And I wanted to come up with an acronym that was no more than 4 letters, because as a student of Buddhism, as an undergraduate, I always had trouble remembering the 10 ways of this or the 12 paths to that. So 4 letters, I think, seemed about right. And as I said, I've been thinking about the 4 elements of gratitude, acceptance, intention, and non-judgment. So it was a number of factors that came into play.
And when I think about it, it seems like something that we all know, but somehow when someone takes the time to put it in an organized thought, like a pattern, then we get more like, oh, aha, right? And it's a good reminder. Like you said, 4 is much easier to remember, and it's a word. It's not a random acronym. Some people pick one that doesn't spell anything, and I'm like, that didn't help me. As you work through this, I would love to hear your perspective a little bit deeper on each one of these things. Let's talk about gratitude and in your own life and in your practice, how gratitude plays a part in that life that you're saying we can all achieve by using these 4 steps.
Sure. Well, we all have much for which to be grateful. I was thinking of the pandemic and the great influenza pandemic of 1918. And as bad as this pandemic is, we actually have a lot for which to be grateful, that it's not worse, that it's not as devastating as the pandemic a little over 100 years ago. For example, we have access to great medical care. We have a vaccine, which is rather miraculous. We have the ability to connect with each other. Even when we were really isolating ourselves physically, we had the opportunity to connect virtually, as you and I have. And, these are sort of miraculous issues. And I'm reminded of a quote from Albert Einstein that happens to be in the book, which is that there's two ways of looking at the world. One is as though nothing is a miracle, and the other is that everything is a miracle. And I think I'm certainly in the latter camp, and I'm very grateful for that. So no matter how bad things are, they can be worse. And so we have a choice. We can either dwell on the negative, or we can dwell on the miracle of everything and the positive. And we do have a negativity bias. We do tend to focus on the negative. So this is a property that we all have, and we shouldn't feel as though we're isolated in that characteristic. I think it just seems to be hardwired into the way we think. And we can talk about how we can change that as well. But, I certainly have much to be for which to be grateful. I was diagnosed with a malignancy about 10 years ago, and the only cure was a bone marrow transplant. And now I take a pill every day, and I'm absolutely free of any evidence of that malignancy, and I feel great. So we can all identify a few really big things in our lives for which we're grateful. So if we sit and contemplate that, this is really uplifting, because it reminds us that we do have a choice. We can ponder the negative, or we can ponder the positive in our lives, and be very grateful for those elements.
As you're talking, I'm thinking about synchronicities. Before we got on, I was listening to a friend who sent me a video chat on Marco Polo, and she was just pondering how she just flew back to Tennessee with her mom. They decided to go look at homes, and that real estate agent ended up doing extra work for them, which is unusual. Now he's referred her to become a real estate agent. So now she's becoming a real estate agent because this random trip to Tennessee, and he recommended some restaurant, which they went to. The people she met ended up introducing her to the man that's now her husband. So she was pondering all these synchronicities that in retrospect, they didn't seem like much at the time. And I think when I think about gratitude, sometimes if we just sit for a minute and think about how all of these things have happened in our life, we can find those kinds of little things to be grateful for. A random trip to the grocery store, and you have a really nice conversation with someone, and it reminds you that people are people and we have connection. I think there's a lot of times little bits of gratitude or crumbs of things to be grateful for as we go throughout our days as well.
Yes, and I think, most importantly, we can be grateful for this moment, just to be alive in this moment. And the more we dwell in this moment, which is really the only moment we ever truly experience, the happier we'll be and the more grateful we'll be.
Yeah, there's that challenge of planning for your future, but not living in that future while you're planning, because you can miss today thinking too far ahead. There's this balance that has to be struck, isn't there?
Absolutely. And I think, we, beside our negativity bias, the other attribute, if you will, that we all possess is an obsession with the past and the future. And I think it's really important to identify to what extent thinking about our past and our future is adaptive, and to what extent it's maladaptive. And for example, as you pointed out, dwelling on the future excessively is maladaptive. It's adaptive, I think, to plan for the future, and we have to put bread on the table, as it were. So we need to do a certain amount of planning for that. We also want to look forward to good times with people we really enjoy being with. And those are adaptive ways of pondering the future. But beyond that, our overthinking of the future inevitably leads to fear and anxiety. And I think certainly the way many of us have felt for the last year and a half, or coming up on 2 years since the pandemic started, certainly is a good example of that. The future is uncertain. How bad is this going to be? And the more we think about that and overthink that, the more fear and anxiety we generate. And I think the same is true of the way we think about the past. I think that it is clearly adaptive to be reminded of our mistakes so that we don't repeat them and we learn from them. And it's adaptive to remember great times we've had. But beyond that, when we overthink the past, we, because of our negativity bias, tend to dwell on self-judgment. We have regret, embarrassment, etc. And so I think if we can recognize the way our minds work and the way we tend to overthink the future and the past and what the results of that are, we can kind of get a laugh at it, if you will, and we can actually rewire our brains. And we can talk about that when we get to the I end game, which is intention.
Mm-hmm. This leads so beautifully into acceptance, doesn't it?
Yes, I think the flip side of all for which we have to be grateful is that pain is part of life, inexorably, and pain and suffering are as much a part of our life as joy and fulfillment. And the more we learn to open our arms and open our heart to this and really bring in that pain and merge with it so that there's no separation between ourselves and that pain, the better off we are. And usually when we do that, as we do in the Gain meditation every morning, as we bring that pain closer and closer and actually visualize having it merge with our heart, which is open to it, we find that it's usually not as bad as we had imagined. And it's actually somewhat liberating. I was listening, Gina, to a conversation on NPR. I think this had to do with an interview between Terry Gross and Aretha Franklin. And the topic came up of blues music and why do we actually love listening to blues music? I certainly do. I grew up in Chicago and the blues is part of my lifeblood. And I think the reason is that, think about a blues tune and how it really touches us and how it's sort of celebratory. And I think that exemplifies the power of acceptance. Is that, let's even celebrate the pain because we all share this and we can all relate to it. And it actually is, it unites us in a way. And, I have something that comes very easily to me when I'm on my acceptance contemplation during my Gain meditation. And that's the death of my son 4 years ago at the age of 29. And so that's the first thing that comes to me with regard to acceptance. We need to identify, as the Serenity Prayer would have it, those things we can change and those we cannot change. And for those that we cannot change, we need to practice acceptance. And so that is certainly a horrible thing in my life that I have to accept. And what happens when I accept the pain associated with Max's death is that it actually brings me to a place of gratitude for the 29 years we had together. And so even in the pain that we experience, there's light. And, I have a formula in the book, Gina, which is suffering equals pain times resistance. Mm-hmm. And if the opposite of resistance might be acceptance, if we lower our resistance towards zero by accepting those things we find painful, the suffering itself will be brought towards zero as well. Suffering equals pain times resistance. So acceptance is a key element toward happiness.
As you're explaining that, I was thinking about suffering. A lot of suffering is self-inflicted, I think, because we torture ourselves with what if, shoulda, woulda, coulda, or resentments. regrets and resentments. And I think we're human, right, Dr. Greg? We're not going to get it 100% right all of the time. And I'm not sure exactly what it is we're afraid of, but I feel like fear is part of that resistance to acceptance, almost as if we accept it, somehow it's going to overtake us. I remember having a conversation once with someone and saying, you've got to turn and face that thing that haunts you. You're going to feel some of that pain again. You're going to feel some of those emotions, but running from it clearly hasn't helped. It's like one of those dreams or a cartoon where you're running and you're going so slow and whatever's chasing you is just catching up, right? I feel like that's how we cause ourselves to suffer. We're afraid of the thing we've already gone through, and somehow we want to avoid it instead of, like you said, accept it. And it sounds harder than it is, I think. I don't know how to put it into words. But it's the stop running, turn and face it, punch that paper tiger and realize you've already gone through it. How can you now put it in a different place, contextualize it differently so it doesn't keep punishing you?
Absolutely. I think that all of these elements of gain are very simple. And if you can just imagine doing the morning gain practice. So we get up in the morning, we open the blinds, we do our morning hygiene, we sit in a comfortable place, a quiet place. Any position is fine. We close our eyes, we get in touch with our breath. We breathe in through our nose slowly to a count of 3. We pause for a count of 3, and then we just, without effort, let the breath go slowly to a count of 4. And we just repeat that a few cycles, and we notice that our heart rate is going down and the amount of adrenaline in our body is going down. And then we begin our contemplation. And, I think a lot of people feel that they failed in meditation because somebody told them they're not supposed to have any thoughts in their head while they meditate. And actually, I'm giving people 4 elements to actually focus on. So I think this is partly why it's such an easy practice. So we get in touch with the breath, we settle down, we sink into our hearts, and then we contemplate things for which we're grateful. And then we transition to acceptance. And we actually find that source of pain. And we picture opening our chest and opening our heart and letting that pain come closer and closer and closer till it's actually inside our heart. So there's no distance, no separation. And we ask ourselves the question, can I live with this pain forever? The answer is yes. And we sit with it and just incorporate it into our breath. There's nothing complex. We're not analyzing it. We're actually just allowing it to come closer and closer. And really, it's rather effortless. And once we have been doing this practice for a few weeks and a few months, it just comes naturally. And at the end of the practice, when we open our eyes, we just feel unburdened. And so there is a simplicity. I think that anything in the way of improving our lives that is complicated is probably not the right thing. It's the answers are very simple and the practice is very simple.
When you talked about, that acceptance piece, it's interesting how those burdens shift when we view them differently. It hasn't changed the reality, right? We're not saying deny the reality or pretend it didn't happen. We're just choosing to, like you said, accept it, see it for what it is, acknowledge that it sucks, it hurts, choose your word, but know that you made it through. And there's a release to that, I think, and even fear of the future, right? Except the fact that we can't control everything that's coming down the pike. We can make good decisions. We can do our best, but there's always that wild card in the world. So let's talk a little bit about how intention fits into this context. So we've begun to practice gratitude, so we shift how we see things. And we work on acceptance, which is also a way of shifting the way we think about things, isn't it? It's taking responsibility and ownership and acknowledging what is without that resentment. How does intention follow up those two steps?
Again, I would go back to the way our brains appear to be wired. And again, very simple. I think there are two elements that tend to veil our innate happiness. And they are a negativity bias. We tend to remember the negative and forget about the positive. And the second is that we tend to obsess and overthink the past and the future. So we can just consider those two elements that appear to be the way we're wired and hypothesize as to why those are part of intrinsically the way our minds work. I think perhaps, we're 50,000 years ago, we're one of the early humans, Homo sapiens, and we're living in a cave. And, there may be a saber-toothed tiger lurking outside the mouth of our cave. And we need to always be on the ready to deal with adversity and always think of the worst thing that can happen. And that may have been an evolutionary advantage, actually, to be on the lookout all the time. But fast forward to 2021, we really don't need to be on the lookout all the time. There are no saber-toothed tigers. There are no monsters. And again, with the combination of our negativity bias and our obsession with the future, we catastrophize. We think about what's the worst thing that could happen, even though it almost certainly will never come to pass. So here are two elements that are embedded in the way we think. And we acknowledge that we all think this way. We're not alone. We don't need to beat ourselves up because we tend to be negative and we tend to obsess over thoughts of the past or the future. We all have this. So the question is, how do we rewire our brains, given that they seem to be intrinsically wired this way? And that's where intention comes in. This is not going to happen by accident, right? And as Jon Kabat-Zinn said, happiness or mindfulness is really awareness of the present moment on purpose. We have to be purposeful, because if we're not, the default in terms of the way our minds work is unhappiness in a way. So how do we practice intention and rewire the way we think away from this negativity bias and away from this obsession with past and future? There are very simple steps that consume virtually no time that you can take on purpose. And I think one great example of that, Gina, is something called 3 Good Things. There has been an ongoing study at Duke University, and I think the person leading that effort for the last 10 years has been Brian Sexton, Sexton, in case anybody wants to Google Brian and see some wonderful YouTube presentations that he's done. He's a very funny and realistic guy, and he's a great teacher. His 3 Good Things programs is simply that as we prepare to go to sleep at night, we're perhaps turning down the bed linens, we think of 3 good things that happen during the day. And ideally, we might write them down. I'm not somebody who tends to write things down like that, but I will think of the 3 good things that happened to me today. So I'm sure tonight they will include that I had a beautiful meditation, a gain meditation this morning. It's a beautiful day here in Northern California. I just came back from visiting my brother in Tucson, where it was 105 and pretty much impossible to go outside and go for a walk. So a good thing for me here, fortunately, is a beautiful day. I will include our conversation, Gina. I might throw in a couple of gratuitous elements as well. I'm sure there'll be some other good things. So it doesn't have to be limited to 3, but contemplating 3 good things that happen during the day as we prepare for bed. And what Dr. Sexton and others have shown in fairly large-scale experiments using a survey, they use a variation of the Maslow burnout inventory. They've shown that people who participate in this 3 good things practice sleep better, and they're happier. They're less depressed. And I think, this is a great example of a very simple intention that's easy to practice. And, we learn by taking small steps, but repeating those steps regularly. So, again, I think just a very simple set of practices every day. Briefly, I think we can do the gain meditation in 3 minutes, but repeat it every day. And 3 good things is one of those. And I think this is one of the most elegant and resonant examples of how a simple intention can help rewire our brains to be more present and more positive.
I was thinking about gratitude and the 3 good things. It's framing, it's reframing, depending, right? So you're framing the way you're looking at the world, but you're also reframing by changing the wiring in your brain. You're teaching your brain to look for those 3 good things throughout the day. If you end your day with a practice like 3 good things, your brain had better be paying attention. You better have something to say at the end of the day. And when we talk about neuroplasticity, that's such a fascinating topic. I listened to a gal named Dr. Carolyn Leaf, and she calls them trees, the dendrites, the way things are formed within the brain, and how toxic thinking, the way it looks in a brain scan versus when someone begins to shift toward gratitude, toward not just positive thinking, because what you're talking about isn't necessarily positive thinking. You're saying we're going to accept the difficulties as well. We're living a more honest relationship with ourselves and our feelings, but we're also choosing to say that happened and it was hard and it's hurtful and it may hurt for the rest of your life. It's not that the pain goes away, but when you accept that that pain is now part of your journey, then you can begin to balance it with, but what is here that brings me joy? What is here that brings that kind of sense of like awe in the day that we live today? The balance to that, it's like sweet and salty, right? Sweet, hot. That's what life is like. It's the joy and the pain together in this experience. And it's so helpful to know that we're not alone. And I think something like this podcast, for example, in our conversation, that's one of the ways it works in people's lives. Someone like you, Dr. Greg, comes on and has a message, and you say it in such a way that you remind people everybody has these experiences. We may express them differently. They may not be the exact same experience, but the emotional journey of joy and pain, laughter and crying, all of it is so natural. And how we deal with it really impacts how much we suffer. We will suffer. That's what you were basically saying. Suffering is going to come, but how much do you want to suffer? You're going to suffer at the hands of that and your own hands? So if we work on that gratitude and we work on that acceptance piece, I think the acceptance piece is the hardest piece for people because you want it to go away. But this intention is such a beautiful next step, because it's where you get to shift what your brain begins to look for.
Well, I think we could consider all of the gain elements either difficult or perfectly simple. I think, yes, acceptance is difficult, and let's go about it in very small baby steps. There is no such thing as failure. We'll practice opening our hearts one little tiny step at a time. And I think if we do that, we can look back over the weeks and months that we've been embracing the practice and realize how much happier we are. I think another gain element that people might think is very difficult is non-judgment, because we are always assessing our environment and rendering judgments of good or bad to everything around us and comparing things, comparing other people to each other and to ourselves, for example. And this is something, again, through intention, on purpose, we can learn to drop the judgments. So when I get to my end and gain every morning and practice non-judgment, I start by, everybody can have their own imagery, if you will. But mine is, I see the Earth as seen from from space, like one of these beautiful NASA photographs of the Earth, and we see some cloud cover, we see the blue oceans and the variegated color of the land. And the Earth is sort of just suspended in space. It's just there. And I recognize that that beautiful planet is neither good nor bad. It just is the way it is. It has this isness, if you will. It didn't do anything wrong. There is no such thing. It doesn't even fit as a descriptor that the Earth could possibly be good or bad. It simply is. And this is a very resonant concept. We didn't create it that way. It just is that way. And then when we learn to drop our judgments of the world, if you will, we can eventually start to point toward ourselves and drop the judgment. I am neither good nor bad. I am just the way I am. I may have a negativity bias. We all have it. It's just there. It's not good. It's not bad. And we can begin to see the world and ultimately ourselves, as Francis Lucille said, with benevolent indifference. It doesn't mean we don't care. It means that we're not judging. And we have a slightly positive way of looking at everything, a certain benevolence. There's a certain beauty to the way things are. But they're not good. They're not bad. We didn't create it the way it is. We didn't create ourselves the way we are. We just are the way we are. And just sitting with that is so liberating. So I think, again, the gratitude, acceptance, intention, and non-judgment are all very, very simple. And to contemplate them at a time early in the day when we're just starting out, this really gets us started out on a beautiful presence. And we can take these principles with us and practice them during the day. So, we're driving to work and that driver ahead of us changes lanes into our lane and cuts us off a bit. We start to make a lot of judgments, let's face it. We can laugh actually as we catch ourselves doing that and just say, well, that guy is neither good nor bad. He's just the way he is. That's the way he drives. And actually, sometimes I might even do that. And we could drop the judgment and kind of get a laugh with it. And I think there's a certain humor in life. At least I certainly think so. And we can appreciate that humor even more when we drop the judgments.
As we think through the gain, you were talking through your own meditation and you talked about the gratitude and the acceptance, the whole thing, because we stopped at A last time. So I'd love to hear the whole, how you process through gain in your meditation as a tool.
Sure. Well, again, we find a comfortable place to sit after we've done whatever we do first thing in the morning. And we just let our eyes close and we begin to pay attention to our breath. And I think breathing in through our nose slowly to a count of 3 and pausing to a count of 3 and then just relaxing the magic recoil of the lungs and our chest, just letting the breath go to a count of 4. And we do this a few times, 2 or 3 times, and we feel ourselves kind of relaxing. And we're just noticing the breath. And then we begin to notice that for which we're grateful. I think of the fact that I'm here today. When I was diagnosed with a form of leukemia 10 years ago, I didn't think I would be alive today. So it's easy for me just to go to the present moment and be grateful for experiencing this moment. And then I may sort of go through a contemplation of the love I have for my significant other and my daughter and her daughter and my brother and other family members. I go through the experience of the privilege to serve others at work, since I do pediatric intensive care medicine and anesthesiology. And it's really a privilege to be able to do that. I'm grateful for it. And several other things for which I'm grateful. And then I transition to acceptance. And again, for me, the first thing that comes to mind is my son and the pain of his death. And then I experience bringing that pain closer and closer as I visualize my chest opening wide and heart inside my chest opening. And this pain associated with my beautiful boy coming closer and closer and becoming a part of my heart and emerging with that experience. And I'm absolutely accepting it fully with open arms and open heart, without any resistance, without any pushing away, without any trying to flee, just sitting with it, letting it hover, letting it be. And then I may also contemplate the pain around the world, the pain that people in Haiti must feel who had their president assassinated, then lost their home in an earthquake, and then had to sleep outside during a torrential rain during a hurricane, and what misery that must have been, and the pain that people are experiencing in Afghanistan and elsewhere. So there's a sort of global pain, and I feel that sort of vibrating and resonating. I also allow that to come into my heart. Then I transition to intention. I may briefly recognize, and a lot of this is sort of without language at this point, since I've been doing this practice for so long, but I can recognize during my intention exercise, if you will, that we do have a negativity bias. We do have an obsession with the past and the future. And my intention for today is simply being aware of and noticing the present moment and remembering to be positive. I catch myself dwelling in the past and judging myself. I let that go. I know that I can do that with purpose. And so my intention for today is to be present, positive, and also kind and generous, and to think of 3 good things. So I practice that in the evening, and then I think of 3 good things again during this game meditation. And then I transition to non-judgment. And again, for me, I'm kind of visualizing the earth suspended in space, clearly neither good nor bad. And then I draw attention to myself and consider myself in the exact same light. It's only logical that if this world is neither good nor bad, the people in it are neither good nor bad as well. We simply are the way we are. And then I go back to my breath and for a few cycles, go back to the noticing of the in-breath, the pause, and the out-breath. And then I will slowly open my eyes, and I generally feel extremely refreshed, unburdened, present. And I know that during the day, I'll bring these elements back to the center of my attention as I'm walking down the hall, as I'm about to go into a patient's room or go for a bike ride. These elements are always there, and they're as accessible as our breath.
There's a real element of surrender, isn't there?
Yes, absolutely.
Instead of feeling like we have to control ourselves and everything else, control all the elements in our lives, that surrender to what we cannot control.
Absolutely. There's a letting go. There's a sinking into the heart, if you will. And it's rather effortless once, again, that we incorporate this into our daily life and it becomes a daily practice.
I think that's the thing. At first, it's more on the discipline side, right? Getting into the habit of something takes discipline, no matter what it is. And I love that it's so simple. And I think in my mind, if people could just take those 4 letters, GAIN, gratitude, acceptance, intention, and non-judgment, and work their way through it in a way that feels authentic to them. You shared your meditation because that's how you do it. And that's just a framework that someone can use to find their discipline, find their way of relating to those things in a way that serves them and helps them to live a less emotionally and mentally burdened life, really, right?
Absolutely, Gina.
Now, if you had to look at someone in the eyes and give them 3 things you really want them to know or to take away, what 3 things would you love for them to really anchor in on? What do you want to remind people of?
I would remind people that we're all in this together, that we're all made of the same stuff, that we all have this negativity bias and we all have this obsession with the past and the future. So that's the first thing. It's like we're all together. We're all really one, and let's not beat ourselves up because we have this way of being or that way of thinking. We're all the same. We all share these elements. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we have the ability to change the way we are and the way we think. We have this thing called neuroplasticity throughout our lives. It's never too late to draw attention to the way we think. And why are we thinking these thoughts? And how can we make changes in our thought patterns for the better? Because we continue to possess this power of intention. So we're all the same. We're all in it together. We all have the ability to change the way we think, to gradually remove or disintegrate the veil, apparently, that covers our happiness. So I guess that would be the second thing. And I think the third thing would be to practice game. And so, it's hard for me to get too far away from that because I think that really embodies the simplicity of the way we can practice and experience our lives.
I love how you use the imagery of disintegrating the veil to our happiness. It's a hopeful message because we have something we can do to do that. We don't have to wait for someone else to do it or a specific circumstance to do it, or a certain amount of money or a house or a car or a relationship. It's within our ability to disintegrate that veil to our happiness. And I think that is a powerful point. It is within all of our power, if you will, to do that. And this is a fantastic tool. How do people get in touch with you, Dr. Greg?
I have a website. It is greghammermd.com, lowercase, no punctuation, greghammermd.com. The book is on Amazon. If they Gain Without Pain and my name or part of my name in the search window at Amazon, they'll find the book. So yes, I would love to hear from anybody out there who wants to get in touch.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you so much for being a part of my podcast, being able to speak such hope and help to my tribe. I really appreciate your gentle and generous and kind spirit. I like the way that you show up, the way that you explain this. You brought hope today through your message, and we've been through a lot as a people throughout this whole world in the last couple of years, and these are those pinpricks of light that I look for to share with my tribe. And I want to thank you for being one of those pinpricks of light in a time when we so desperately need it.
Absolutely. My pleasure, Gina. Anytime.
Awesome. Friends, today we've been speaking with Dr. Greg Hammer. He's a professor, a physician, an author, and a mindfulness expert. If you head over to www.feminineroadmap.com/episode 242, I will have links to Greg and his book. And while you're there, please leave your name and email address. Join my tribe. I send out periodic encouraging emails. And just realize, friends, how much is in our power to shift the way that we look at what's happening in us, to us, around us, and how that's impacting how we're showing up in the world. This simple practice of the GAIN method of meditation can give us the ability to get back in the driver's seat of our lives, to live a more honest life of integrity with how we feel and how we're viewing the world. And we can find a gentleness, a kindness, an honesty, a love for ourselves and others that might otherwise be difficult to find. So I encourage you to try the GAIN method. I encourage you to give it a practice and let us know how that works. Let us know how it opens up or disintegrates that veil to your happiness. Thank you so much for listening to us today. We hope that you've gained something from this. We ask that you share this podcast with someone who needs it. Thank you for being a part of the tribe. We look forward to speaking to you again in the weeks to come. Take care, my friends. Bye-bye.